The sliding doors of Mercy Cross Hospital didn't blow open. They were ripped off entirely. Tilda Marsh heard the sound before she saw anything. A bone-deep percussion hammering through the linoleum floor beneath her orthopedic boots, rising up through the soles, through her ankles, rattling the cheap fillings in her back molars. She knew that sound. She had fallen asleep to that sound for 4 years in places that didn't appear on unclassified maps. It was the heavy twin-rotor thrum of military helicopters, and they weren't slowing down. She was standing in the medication storage corridor off Ward C, counting Dilaudid vials for the 3rd time, because Dr. Harmon's count had been off again and nobody else was going to fix it. That was Tilda's life at Mercy Cross. She fixed things nobody else noticed, in rooms nobody else entered, at hours nobody else worked. Thud, step, thud, step. The sound of her walk was its own kind of announcement. The thick rubber tip of her forearm, crutch, hitting linoleum. Then the drag of her left boot, heel trailing slightly. A spinal compression fracture, the intake paperwork said when she first started at Mercy Cross 2 years ago. The HR coordinator had read it with that particular tilt of the head people used when they were deciding whether to feel sorry for you or simply relieved that you were manageable. She had been assigned to medication inventory and shift discharge paperwork on day 1. She was still there. The overhead PA crackled. Code yellow. All non-essential personnel to secondary stations. Tilda set down the clipboard. Through the narrow window at the end of the corridor, the parking lot outside had turned white with rotor wash. She counted the silhouettes dropping out of the gray November sky. 3, 4, 5. No, 4. 4 Black Hawk variants, and they weren't landing on the rooftop pad. They were coming down in the ambulance staging area, scattering every vehicle in a 60-foot radius like toys. She already knew this was not a standard medevac. Standard medevacs called ahead. Dr. Franklin Ossie owned the emergency department at Mercy Cross, the way certain men own rooms. Loudly, completely, and without ever having earned it through anything but duration. He had been chief of emergency medicine for 11 years. He referenced this fact in staff meetings, in hallway conversations, and once, memorably, in a patient complaint review that had nothing to do with him. O.C. was the kind of doctor who treated nurses like furniture, and furniture like an inconvenience. Tilda had worked 1 shift in his ER, her first week at Mercy Cross. She had suggested a different approach to attention pneumothorax, presenting in Bay 4, a patient who was deteriorating faster than OC's protocol accounted for. She had not been aggressive about it. She had simply said quietly that in her experience the standard decompression site wasn't going to be sufficient given the mechanism, and that they might consider. O.C. had looked at her the way people look at a car alarm. Present, irritating, irrelevant. You're the supply tech, he had said. Not a suggestion, a categorization. She had gone back to her corridor. The patient had been transferred to the ICU 40 minutes later with a second tension event. He survived. O.C. never mentioned it again. The first Marines came through the ambulance bay at 11:47 p.m. Tilda had already moved from the medication corridor toward the central nursing station, not because anyone had told her to, but because the vibration in the floor had shifted, closer, more purposeful, and something older than thought in her had oriented itself toward the entrance, like a compass needle finding north. She stood near the supply station at the far end of the main corridor and watched. 8 Marines in full combat load, plates, helmets, rifles at the low ready, moved through the destroyed door frame with the precise overlapping footwork of people who had practiced entering contested spaces until the movement became cellular. They established a perimeter around the entrance without a word. 3 took positions at the corridor junctions. 2 moved to the triage desk. 1 stayed at the threshold, watching the parking lot. Behind them came the litter. 4 Marines carried it at a dead run, the man on it barely visible beneath the tangle of field dressings, IV lines, and monitoring leads that had been rigged with whatever was available. The man's chest was moving, barely, and the left side of his uniform had been cut away to expose a field dressing the size of a dinner plate, saturated dark red and packed with what looked like a hemostatic agent applied in desperate, layered quantities. Walking alongside the litter, one hand on the man's shoulder, eyes already scanning the room, a woman, combat utilities, rank insignia stripped for the field. Master Sergeant, Tilda noted from the sleeve tapes still present. The woman's face was cut across the left cheekbone, and she had not stopped moving since entering the building. The Marines reached the triage desk. The Master Sergeant looked at the charge nurse behind it, young, 3 months out of school frozen, and said, with the calm of someone who had run out of patience hours ago, "Surgical trauma team, now. Where?" The charge nurse pointed toward the ER. Her hand was shaking. Dr. Osai materialized from the trauma corridor with the energy of a man who had never been told no. He positioned himself in the center of the hallway like a toll booth. "You cannot bring weapons into this facility," Osai said. "This is a civilian hospital. Whatever this is, you need to go through proper." The Master Sergeant did not stop walking. She angled her path 2 degrees and went around him as if he were a traffic cone. Osai turned, his face darkening. "I am the chief of emergency medicine at this hospital, and you will stop." One of the Marines, young, enormous, carrying the rear of the litter, looked over his shoulder at Osei without breaking stride. "Sir, we will be out of your way as soon as we find who we're looking for. I'd recommend stepping back." "Who?" Osei spread his hands. "Who are you looking for? I know every staff member in this." The Master Sergeant had stopped at the entrance to the trauma bay. She turned around. Her eyes moved across the ER, across the frozen residents, the charge nurse, the security officer pressing himself against the wall, and then they moved down the corridor, past the nursing station, past the medication alcove. They stopped. "There," she said. Tilda had not moved. She was still standing at the supply station at the end of the corridor, crutch under her right arm, watching. She had watched the entrance. She had watched the litter. She had watched the field dressings and the IV lines, and the angle of the man's neck and the color of the hemostatic packing, and the way the Master Sergeant's left hand stayed on the patient's shoulder even when she was talking to people. Even when she was moving fast, the hand staying, the connection staying, she had seen all of it, and she had stayed very still. The Master Sergeant walked toward her, not hurrying now. The Marines near the triage desk rotated slightly, tracking their senior's movement. The ones at the corridor junctions held. The Master Sergeant stopped 4 feet away. Up close, the cut on her cheek was deeper than it had looked from a distance. She needed stitches she clearly hadn't asked anyone for. "Matilda Voss?" the Master Sergeant said. Something cold and electric moved through Tilda's chest. She had not heard that name, her full name, said by someone who knew what it meant, in 26 months. "Who's asking?" Tilda said. Not a question. She already knew this was not a conversation she could walk away from. The Master Sergeant reached into the left cargo pocket of her utilities and produced a laminated card, which she held out. Tilda looked at it. It was a personnel photo. She was younger in it. Her hair shorter, her face unmarked, clipped to a service record summary with a designation at the top that made Dr. Ose, who had followed at a distance and was reading over someone's shoulder, go very quiet. Naval Special Warfare Command, Fleet Marine Force, Trauma Specialist, call sign, Ferris 7. My commanding officer is on that litter, the master sergeant said. He has a hemothorax and a suspected aortic shear from blunt trauma to the chest. His pressure is 60 over nothing and dropping. We stabilized him in the field for 22 minutes. We have maybe 15 left. She paused. The surgical residents in your trauma bay look like they graduated last week. Your chief of medicine just tried to redirect a medevac. Another pause. We found you. Tilda looked past the master sergeant at the litter. She looked at the field dressings. She looked at the angle of the patient's jaw, the color of his lips, the rate of rise and fall in his chest. She looked at the IV lines and estimated the drip rate and did the math on how long ago those bags had been spiked. 14 minutes, maybe 12 if his pressure was already crashing when they bagged him on the ground. She looked back at the master sergeant. What's his blood type? O negative. We have 2 units left. Allergies. Undocumented. He's current on everything. Tilda shifted her weight onto her crutch and turned toward the trauma bay without another word. Absolutely not. Ozzy had recovered. He stepped in front of the trauma bay entrance, arms at his sides, chin up, doing the thing he did when he had decided a situation required his authority. She is a medication inventory technician, Ozzy said. She does not have surgical privileges at this hospital. She does not have surgical privileges anywhere. Whatever her background, get out of the way, Dr. Ozzy. Tilda said it without looking at him. I will have you removed from. He has a hemothorax. She stopped. She turned to look at Ozzy fully. His mediastinum is shifting. If you don't let me into that bay in the next 90 seconds, the shift is going to compress his trachea, and you will watch him die in your corridor. She held his gaze. If that happens and your staff has been standing here watching you block the entrance, the liability conversation is going to be very short. Ozzy stared at her. The charge nurse behind him looked at the litter, then at Ozzy. Then she stepped aside. Ozzy turned to look at her. Brinkman. I'm getting her a gown, Brinkman said, already moving. The trauma bay at Mercy Cross was not Bastion. It was not Camp Leatherneck. It was not the back of a CH-53 doing evasive maneuvers at 200 feet with a man bleeding out on a stretch of cargo netting. But the ceiling was there. The lights were there. The instruments were where instruments were supposed to be. Tilda had walked this bay in the dark, metaphorically, for months. She had stocked every drawer, cataloged every supply, filed every replacement order, and she knew this room the way she had once known the layout of a field aid station she'd shared with 11 men for 14 weeks. She scrubbed in fast. Her hands under the water were steady. They had always been steady. That was the thing people didn't understand. The leg, the spine, the crutch, the thud step of her walk had nothing to do with her hands. Her hands had been steady when she was 23. And repacking a sucking chest wound in the back of a vehicle, while the vehicle was moving and she couldn't hear anything over the gunfire. They had been steady at 27 when she'd run a makeshift surgical assist for 6 hours straight, with no attending and a flashlight held by a lance corporal. They were steady now. Brinkman helped her gown up. The master sergeant, she'd given her name as Quan, stayed at the head of the litter, monitoring. One of the Marines positioned himself at the vitals display and read numbers when Tilda asked for them. The patient's name was Colonel Adebayo. Tilda didn't know him. She didn't need to. On the table, he was just a man with a shearing injury to his descending aorta and a chest full of blood, and the only thing that mattered was the order of the next 4 minutes. Left anterolateral thoracotomy, Tilda said. I need a number 10 blade, rib spreader, suction, and I need whoever is running that blood bank to get me 4 more units of O-neg in this room in 4 minutes, or we're going to run out of options. Brinkman was already on the phone. The resident. Tilda didn't know his name. He looked about 25. He was trying very hard not to show that his hands were shaking, positioned himself across the table. You're my assist, Tilda said. Do exactly what I say when I say it, and nothing else. Can you do that? He nodded. Say yes or no. Yes, he said. Good. She pressed the blade to the skin and made the incision. The blood was immediate and considerable. She had expected it. She packed the suction tube into the field and told the resident. His name, she learned in the next 30 seconds, was Coffee, said so on his badge, to hold retraction on the lung. He did. His hands were still shaking slightly, but they were accurate, which was what mattered. The aortic tear was where she had estimated it would be. A horizontal shear, irregular margins, the kind of injury that happened when a body decelerated faster than the vessel anchoring it. Blunt force, high-speed impact, something that had happened very fast and very hard. Quan watched from the head of the table. She didn't speak. Tilda respected that. Vascular clamp, large. Coffee reached for the tray. His hand hovered over 2 options. Tilda said, "Your left," without looking up. He picked the correct one and placed it. She worked the clamp past the injury site, feeling rather than seeing the placement in the narrow field, and locked it. The arterial bleeding slowed. Pressure? She said. 58/40, the Marine at the monitor said. Still low, but moving. She looked at the torn margins of the aorta and began working through the repair in her head. How many sutures? What angle? How much tension the tissue would bear given its current condition? And her hands moved accordingly, which they had always done, the gap between thinking and doing narrow as a blade. She had not been in an oar in 26 months. It did not feel like 26 months. There was a moment, about 20 minutes in, when the repair was holding and Adebayo's pressure had climbed to 80, and Coffee's hands had stopped shaking, and Quan had allowed herself one long exhale through her nose. There was a moment when Tilda became aware that the observation window above the trauma bay was crowded. Faces pressed to the glass. Nurses, residents, the charge nurse from the desk who had stepped aside. 2 attendings she recognized from the cardiology floor who had no business being down here at midnight. A hospital administrator in a shirt that suggested he had dressed very fast. And Dr. Osi, standing at the back, watching. She noted this and returned to the repair. She closed at 12:44 a.m. Last suture, last knot, margins holding, no visible leak at the repair site. She stood back and looked at the monitor. Adebayo's pressure was 110/72. His heart rhythm was sinus. His color was coming back. Coffee let out a breath that sounded like it had been held since the first incision. Quan stepped forward and looked at the monitor for a long moment. Then she looked at Tilda. He's going to need to be moved to a proper surgical ICU, Tilda said, already stripping her gloves. The repair will hold for transport, probably. Don't let anyone touch the wound site who hasn't done vascular work. Understood, Quan said. A beat of quiet. You look different with a crutch, Quan said. It was not said unkindly. You look different without body armor, Tilda said. Something moved across Quan's face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. The main corridor of Mercy Cross Emergency at 1 in the morning looked like a theater at intermission. People standing in clusters, speaking in low voices, all of them oriented toward the trauma bay. The Marines had moved their perimeter slightly inward, consolidated, professional. Adebayo was being transferred to the transport litter by 2 medics who had materialized from somewhere. Dr. Osi was standing at the triage desk. He had positioned himself there with the deliberate quality of someone choosing the high ground in a conversation scene they had already decided to have. Hands in his coat pockets, chin up. The expression of a man constructing his case. Tilda came out of the trauma bay with Quan half a step behind. Jenkins. Osei used the wrong name. It was her badge name, the name on the paperwork, the name nobody had bothered to look past when she'd taken the inventory job. You performed an unauthorized surgical procedure in my emergency department. Without privileges, without a supervising attending. I don't care what your military record says. You will face a review board. I will personally recommend. Her name is not Jenkins. Quan said it at normal volume, which was somehow more effective than if she had shouted. Osi stopped. Quan moved to stand beside Tilda. Not behind her, beside her, and looked at Osi with the patience of someone who had been awake for 31 hours and had spent most of them in worse situations than this. Her name is Lieutenant Commander Matilda Voss, Quan said. United States Navy. She spent 4 years forward deployed as a trauma specialist with Fleet Marine Force units in areas you are not cleared to know about. She performed emergency surgical interventions in the field on 47 documented cases. She holds a Bronze Star with Valor device and a Navy Commendation Medal with a citation she won't tell you about because it's classified. Quan paused. She was medically separated after a spinal injury sustained during a casualty evacuation in which she re-entered a collapsed structure twice to recover wounded Marines. Both of them lived. The corridor was entirely silent. Brinkman, standing near the nursing station, had both hands pressed flat on the desk. Coffee, the resident, was standing in the doorway of the trauma bay. His face was doing something complicated. Osi's mouth was moving without producing sound. I want to be very clear, Quan continued, that we came to this hospital tonight specifically for her. Not for your staff, not for your facility, for her. Because when my commanding officer's aorta was shearing apart and the nearest military surgical asset was 40 minutes away, her name was the one on the list. Another pause, and she saved his life in your supply corridor's neighboring room. Quan said, while you were standing in the doorway. Osi looked at Tilda. Tilda looked back at him. She had worked 2 years in this building with her eyes down, her voice quiet, her crutch clicking through supply closets at 5 in the morning, so she could have everything sorted before the day staff arrived. And nobody would have to wait on her slow walk to notice that something was missing. She had watched patients get worse management than they deserved, and had kept her mouth at the level of the floor. She had eaten lunch alone in the medication room because the break room went quiet when she walked in, and she had stopped being willing to perform the work of pretending not to notice. She reached into the chest pocket of her scrubs, the ones Brinkman had handed her 40 minutes ago, and produced the laminated ID badge. Mercy Cross Regional Medical Center. Jenkins, T. Pharmacy and Supply Tech. She set it on the triage desk. She did not throw it. She did not make a speech about it. She simply set it down, the way you set something down when it was never really yours to carry. Then she turned to Quan. When does your unit ship? She said. Quan's expression shifted, relief, barely contained. 10 days. We're staging out of Lejeune. I need to coordinate an early termination on a lease, Tilda said. And I need 48 hours to clear my apartment. Done, Quan said immediately. Tilda nodded once. She turned and walked back down the corridor. Thud, step, thud, step. Toward the exit where the Marines had established their perimeter. Toward the parking lot where the helicopters were still turning. Toward the cold November air and the smell of jet fuel and whatever came next. Behind her, she heard Coffee say, to no one in particular, "She's the one who taught me where the vascular clamp was." He was not wrong. She had stocked that tray herself twice a week for 22 months. She had made sure everything was where it was supposed to be. That, it turned out, was the kind of work that looked like nothing until the night it looked like everything. She walked out through the broken door frame into the cold and didn't look back.